instruments. First of all, a very warm welcome to dear Professor MILENA DRAGIĆEVIĆ-ŠEŠIĆ, Professor Emerita of the University of Arts in Belgrade, UNESCO Chair, then Ambassador Cynthia Schneider, Distinguished Professor in the Practice of Diplomacy from Georgetown University, Dr. MONIKA MOKRE, Institute of Cultural Studies and Theatre History, Austrian Academy of Sciences, and finally, Mr. Dag NYLANDER, Director of Norwegian Center for Conflict Resolution. As you heard, my name is Ljiljana Rogac-Mijatovic, and I'm Associate Professor at Faculty of Drama Arts, University of Arts in Belgrade. And at the very beginning, so let me invite Professor Emerita MILENA DRAGIČEVIĆ-ŠEŠIĆ, who is also the founder of the UNESCO Chair for Interculturalism, Art Management and Mediation at the University of Arts in Belgrade, to address the topic as a co-chair of this conference and give an opening statement on the role of culture in mediation. Professor MILENA, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ljiljana, for this nice introduction. And I invite Emilia to start showing the slides. I have to say that I will try to persuade you that the title of our session is very good, that's under brackets, small things, because art is very important, and cultural instruments, not only art, are also values and opinions and so on, are extremely important. So I started this presentation exactly with the work of Ilya and Emilia Kabakov about refugee. We use today the word migrants, those who are avoiding conflicts. I would never call them migrants. I would like that we stick to the word refugee, because it refers better to the reality of contemporary world. Because we hear, what we can see here is a refugee running from one conflict in his country, caught on the wall somewhere in between, preventing him as a symbol of a conflict with a new, what should be hospitality, host population, but in a situation of, as the reader is saying, hostipality, so hostile relation and kind of hospitality, making or putting for them special institutions and so on. So power of culture, I have to say, probably was more used in 19th and 20th century, both in a positive and in a negative manner within international relations. But now in these 30 years around turn of the millennium, it's not that much used. Although we have to say that throughout the 19th, 20th century, we have books, films, theater performance that also participated in the negative processes, celebrating colonial conquests. There were a lot of propaganda and anti-Semitic films. But on the other side, we have a lot of books that celebrated others, that entered in intercultural dialogue. To mention one of the first novel of this kind of anonymous author, refugee from Caucasus in 20s, written under the pseudonym Kurban Said. The book is kind of a novel, Ali and Nino, romance between a Muslim Azerbaijani boy and Christian Georgian girl in Baku. There is, of course, a little problem. The only negative personality in the book is the Armenian boy. So in literature, in arts, we can find also same prejudices as we can find them in a real life, but we can find also the celebration of the other and making us competing our negative emotions, emotions of fear, emotions of humiliation, and try to have emotions of hope. To use this paradigms of Dominique Moissy, and I put here 3 books on which I try to base my lecture or my small presentation today. Fear of global conflict kept under control potential local conflicts during Cold War. But now, dissolution of Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact gave a lot of hope to oppressed groups and minorities to raise their demands locally, knowing that their regimes will not be supported by Warsaw Pact anymore. The same, but not really the same, but similar manner, local conflicts, or at least minority demands, are raising in democracies. I will ask for the next slide, as democracies are constantly, I taught one about the Sami, but probably I didn't put it on time, that they're promoting values of equity, human rights, and so on. So, for example, Sami population from Finland and from Sweden, only since joining of those countries to European Union, started asking their claims, their demands, and that's a difference from probably what is going on or happening in new democracies or in autocratic, stabilocratic regimes. It's going to be, that was approved, and now they have their institutions, the support for the development of languages, and so on. Conflicts today, local conflicts, are numerous everywhere, even in the oldest democracy. So conflicts from the Black Lives Matter on one and Trump supporters on the other side, or each one with police forces, were also violent as conflicts that before could be seen in mostly autocratic countries, where people thought there is no other way for their voices to be heard, and so on. Populist governance today are making feeling in the people, emotion of, I'm not heard, I do not have other way than to go on the street to put my demands out. Illiberal political systems, especially in the hybrid partocratic stabilocracies, from Turkey, India to Serbia, with their autocratic approach, are reinforcing social divisions and tensions in communities by their explicit and implicit policies in all domain. This is partially represented in this artwork of Milica Tomic, showing to what extent these identities or claim to identities are in fact, as Amin Malouf would say, killing identities. She's speaking, I'm Bosnian, I'm Norwegian, and so on, and her body becomes, it's a video that it's turning around her more and more bloody. Unfortunately, most of the public systems are not developing tools and instruments of mediation and reconciliation. Look at governments on all levels in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Look at Serbian, at Bulgarian, at any government, and in Romanian regarding conflicts with the Roma population, very present, and so on. As even sometimes official discourses are those of hatred, exclusion of the other, especially of the minorities. The national culture, or what we call ethnic-based approach to cultural policy, is used as the factor of the exclusion of the other who cannot identify and who cannot feel belonging to this community where his minority culture is not studied and valued. Or even opposite to that. I had witnessed going around state of Karnataka temples under UNESCO protection, Hindi temples, that different local guide would use the same phrase, and then this temple developed and so on, and then some evil people, probably Muslims, settled in this temple, made fireplace and desecrated this place and so on. This is repeating not only to us foreigners that are visiting, this is repeated also to school children visiting, and sometimes we have witnessed that school children are of mixed religion, and we couldn't stop asking ourselves how the Muslim child is feeling, listening this kind of statements. Today in Turkey, everything that was Byzantine, that was this slide I wanted to show, but we can go further about Sami that finally very recently got their rights. In Turkey, Byzantium heritage is now once again reconverted into mosques, although the form of a museum that kept respect to both religion and to practices of both communities would be, I think, the excellent solution for this kind of shared heritage to whom certain groups do not want to stay shared, but to be exclusive theirs. In India, we had also the same battles for the memory sites. We have even this battle recently on Kosovo or around one temple in between two Christian churches, Orthodox and Catholic, and so on. That's the very typical, not only for Byzantium heritage, it happens in Turkey toward Armenian heritage, which is constantly in cars. All architecture is named as a Russian and everything is named as a Russian because it seems today it's easier to deal with Russian than with Armenian heritage. But I would like to underline even more these conflicts which last for years and for each neither local national policies, neither international policies are finding the suitable solution. It's a Kurdish population that is deprived of the rights of education in their language throughout the world they are living. It's only now that in Rojava, in a small territory of Syria, for the first time they have established the university that can deliver teaching in Kurdish language, but we are going to see for how long it's going to exist. Next slide, please, because the one Turk who dared to help resolve local conflicts in Diyarbakir using exactly culture, founding Anadolu Kultur Foundation, is today 1,174 days in prison, Osman Kavala. And there are very, very few voices that are heard in Europe, mostly from cultural sector, but not from political side, asking for his relief because he is there without trial, without judgment, without persecution, and so on. And why he's guilty? Because he created a cultural center in Diyarbakir where a dialogue with the Kurdish population, with the Kurdish culture, where only Saturday afternoon the children of Kurdish origin could have few courses in their national language. So the number of academics that are threatened, that are imprisoned, even from private universities like Bilgi University, not to speak about the public universities, demands all of us, international community, also to mediate, because they were accused exactly because of culture, because of using or trying to use the power of culture in the process of mediation, but the process of mediation that was not approved by public authorities. I have to say that we are guilty also, cultural people. All of us are rushing to exhibit or to visit Venice Biennial. What is the concept of Venice Biennial? It's a concept of the right to exhibition of nation state. So Kurdish people, Roma, we lobbied, and because they are not threatening power for the territory of any country, it was allowed, although the Venice Biennale organizers told us who've been in committee for Roma Pavilion, what if for the next biennial, the Kurdish population would come and ask to exhibit at Venice Biennial? That we will not be able to allow because it's going to offend Turkey. So you see that we do not always use the power of culture to negotiate conflict, but we are submitting our heads under the power of the stronger side. Slide 7, please. Now, we also should speak more about power of media to be used together with arts and culture in conflict prevention, resolution, and process of reconciliation. But it seems that those were very rare examples. Here we can see one, because it's one of the Pakistan and India, organized by two big medias that immediately by populists have been called tycoon media. It was, I have to say, 10 years before I heard this word tycoon media in Serbia, which is now very common and so it shows also to what extent populists of all countries easily unite in defining vocabulary. But here we see the efforts of two strong media to make friendship among the people.
You muted yourself. Okay, no, it's okay.
It's probably just by chance. But on the right-hand side, we see another kind of message that is directly claim that that's a hug, which is not brotherly hug, but that was in Pakistan in newspapers of the other kind that promotes hatred and so on, that this brother is putting the knife in the back. So to make kind of a statement, cultural means and instruments are not officially used in conflict prevention. And that's the huge problem, because that's where we have to start with, in educational and cultural public programs. Although they might be, as artists are foreseeing much in advance, how emotions of people are developing and what will be the result, very useful tools. Islamic project, for example, of the Moscow art group was developed long before 9/11. They felt this emotion of fear, cultural fear that is spreading in the West and everywhere in the Christian world from the Islam, that it's going to conquer, to ruin their heritage of freedom, to ruin their heritage of democracy. Here on the right side is their postcard, how Serbian people imagine Albanian conquest of our democracy, even by making our parliament and mosque and so on. So also, second, arts and culture are rarely used in conflict resolution, as those processes are basically taken by politicians. And there they speak about borders, territories, sharing of economic resources, political organization and organization. In Dayton, for example, there were no discussions about art or culture, or there were no representatives of these sectors. It's typical kind of political settlements or economical peace settlements, like the last one between Kosovo and Serbia under the Trump supervision, was really even the part of real reconciliation process, because it has its different hidden agenda that had nothing to do with the region, and it didn't solve any real problem in the area. The third process of reconciliation, however, is using quite a lot of arts and culture and as means and instruments. In South Africa, in Northern Ireland, even within Bosnia and Herzegovina, but to smaller extent, even more than there among Kosovo and Serbia. But this is often happening due to artist interest and artist commitment, sometimes supported by governments, more often by international organizations, but most often by their own acting as an individual agent. Such artists like Vahida Ramukic, for example, that deals a lot with school manuals, making her illustration, offering them to different communities that are not speaking among themselves, that are not communicating among themselves, because they think everything bad, stereotyped about others. Projects, for example, artistic projects linked to culture of memory are important part of reconciliation, as often not only that memory is different, but memory might be stolen from the subaltern minority, like in case of Palestinian heritage in Jerusalem or in occupied territories, because it's ruined, especially urban heritage sites. Thus, many Israeli performance artists and scholars, such as Mia Amir, Dorit Yerushalmi, Avital Barak, Daphna Ben Shaul, to nominate some of them, are developing projects and performances devoted especially to these issues, to raise attention of Israeli population that those sites that they are marching today used to be sites of Palestinian culture, important for their self-consideration and so on. The same in Balkans. Only artists dare to develop discourse about the negative past. 4 Faces of Omarska. Omarska was just a mine. Again, it's a mine with the Indian owners, but it used to be a special kind of a camp. And we can see here happening in Banja Luka on Serbian territory, how they try through workshops, through educational activities to raise awareness. And that's how the process of reconciliation might start. When we start speaking about our negative past, not only, as it was typical for many countries till today, that we speak only about each of the groups in conflict, about its own victims and victim groups. We have now to start in the reconciliation process, have to start by speaking about the negative past, and artists such as in Germany, Jochen Gerz, are excellent examples of this power of culture. The world, I think, should I close now? Okay, I will just quote this, that World Values Survey shows that support for democratic principles is almost universal when and as national economies develop and societies evolve from survival values toward self-expression values. But many new democracies have weak or corrupt institutions, do not espouse or achieve lower levels of state and civil violence, and have leaders and publics with limited tolerance for minorities. At the same time, elite mobilization of ethnic differences in intrastate or regional conflicts can intensify and reconfigure communal identity in ways that make concord work much more difficult. typical examples are India, Balkans, Central Africa, Caucasus, and I think that in the second round I will tell more about Mediation organization and Concord organization that can use art and culture for these purposes.
Thank you very much, Professor Milena. You raised a lot of questions and as always gave us a really a huge line of interesting examples from arts practices and arts projects. And I especially appreciate for mentioning geopolitics of emotion. I think that concept can be useful for all of us. And then to move to our next panelist, Dr. MONIKA MOKRE, who comes with a background in political sciences and covers an academic experience also in cultural policies, cultural diplomacy, but also migration and cultural differences. So MONIKA, I would invite you to share with us your thoughts on the very different connotations of culture and this ambiguous role that culture can play in conflict, and also how this notion of transversal cultural relations may make a difference in conflict resolution. MONIKA, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ljiljana. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you, Milena, for your, as always, very inspiring introductory statement. Yeah, I mean, when we talk about culture, the problem is that usually we do not really know what we are talking about, as this is such a underdefined or overdetermined term. And we can see that even in the introduction to this conference, on the one hand, it speaks about intercultural dialogue, and on the other hand, of cultural means and instruments. And I would try to deal a bit with that. I mean, also in Milena's statement, it was very clear that we have like different layers here. So it is clear, I guess, on the one hand, we have culture as a whole way of life, as values, traditions, norms, and so on. And here, sometimes we speak about universal or general cultural traits on the one hand. So for instance, yesterday I thought it very interesting that Ambassador Sebers-Plegona spoke about a culture of peace as opposed to a culture of war, which would be more universal, general understandings. However, very frequently, and I think more frequently and very problematically, nowadays it is about cultural differences, understood as ethnic differences, and also naturalized in a way. So this is this one part which is in itself contested, and then we have cultural and artistic activities, and they are somehow related to this understanding of culture, but also this relation is to a very high degree contested, I would say. So on the one hand, we can say and define arts or cultural productions as the most condensed form to express a certain culture. But on the other hand, we also speak a lot, and I think it's important, about freedom of the arts. And this freedom can also mean to contest precisely these norms, cultural norms, but also political or economic norms. Now, somehow all this is true. I think there's no way to say this is the right way to look at that and this is the wrong way. And it can be made true or wrong. And I think this is my main point. We construct these kind of differences in our discourse, in our societies. And I think this is especially important when we speak about conflicts. So yesterday, Ambassador Al-Jawaili said that sometimes it seems that it is the easiest way to understand or to try to explain a conflict by saying this conflict has cultural roots. But this doesn't have to be true. And I would even say it is very difficult to really figure out what are the root causes of a conflict and what are the most important causes. And I'm also not so sure if this is so important. I think this has a lot to do with our preconceived understandings of the world, to see what is to define the root cause of a conflict. So, for instance, out of a Marxist perspective, you say economy is on the base of each conflict. And any other explanation for a conflict would be wrong consciousness. And I mean, there are really very good arguments for this point of view. Still, it is obviously oversimplified. There's no question about that. So I think, or I, as a political scientist, as well as a political activist, I rather look at the political outcomes of different understandings and to see what comes out of our understanding of such a conflict. And now my background as an activist especially is with refugees and migrants. I agree, by the way, with Milena that we should say refugees when we talk about people who are forced to migrate. However, I also deal with people where I would say, okay, they voluntarily chose another country and it should be their right, but that's just a sidestep. And I think these experiences which I have in Austria can be up to some degree generalized for Western Europe at least. And here, I mean, what we see here is what, I like this term, by the way, what is called hospitality by Milena, I have to use that, on different levels. So on the one hand, there is this fundamental conflict, should refugees and migrants be allowed at all to live in our countries, to live with us? Then there are also the question, which people should be allowed to stay? What do they have to do in order to be allowed to stay? And somehow culture and cultural conflicts play a huge role in all these questions. It's a question of integration, for instance. Now we can discuss if integration should be allowed or not, further or not, but even when we say, okay, integration is important, it's mostly about culture. So you have either differences which cannot be overcome or which can be overcome, but it is about culture, I would say. And thereby, so in my own personal political activities, I really tried to not to look at culture in the first place, to put it like that, but for instance, rather on experiences which can be different or similar. So just as a personal example, I discussed with a friend of Pakistan, and we figured out that our education up to some degree was very similar. He was educated in a very strict Muslim family. I was educated in a very strict Catholic family. There are many similarities in that. However, there are other differences with regard to family structures, with regard to hierarchies, and especially with regard to the experience of being a refugee, which I don't have. But so you can disentangle that in a personal way, and I think that is important. On a larger scale, to bring another example, as you know, we had a terrorist attack in Vienna, in my city, on the 2nd of November. And the first generalized reaction to that was, this is due to the fact that there are Muslims in Austria. And now we have a young man who was the terrorist, who was also killed during this time. And yes, he was a Muslim. And probably this deed had something to do with his understanding of religion. He also was an Albanian from Northern Macedonia. And maybe most importantly, he spent more or less all his life in Austria. He came to Austria when by the age of 3 years. So there can be many reasons for what he did, and I guess we will not figure that out because this was an individual and the individual is dead. But when we start up by saying the problem is Islam or that he was a Muslim, when we say, as it is said now in Austria, and by the way, not only by the populist right, but also by our other conservative government, and I said, okay, the problem is political Islam. We don't even know what it is, actually. It is not defined. It is, I would say, a signifier. It is the others who are against us. And here we get into this problem that Milena also described. And here, this means then that dialogue is cut off, communication is cut off by saying this is a religious problem, a cultural problem. So my main point here would be not to emphasize possible cultural causes for conflicts, but rather focus on other causes. However, to come to the end of this statement, obviously I do not want to say that culture doesn't matter at all. Yesterday, Professor JISHENG said that our actions and our understandings of the world follow different logics, and one is the logic of habit. It is only one of 3 logics that he mentioned, but this logic of habit, I think, has a lot to do with norms, with values, so with our culture. In these conflicts I'm talking about, which take place within the global north, Western Europe, I think a main problem is there is this explicit or at least implicit understanding Western culture is superior to other cultures. And this is hindering any kind of communication, of mutual understanding, of deep listening, something which also was mentioned very frequently yesterday. I also think that this term intercultural dialogue as a term, not what is going on there, this is very interesting and exciting, but as a term somehow suggests that we have two blocks or several blocks of cultures which have to get into a dialogue, which I think is also, this is somehow not the case. And this is why we developed quite some time ago, together with a colleague of mine, Josip Batoro, this term of transversal cultural relations, saying cultures are contradictory and multiple in themselves. And on the other hand, they can be similar to each other, also something that Ambassador Al-Chevalier mentioned yesterday. So I think when we try to focus on transversal relations between individual people, between institutions, between organizations who are somehow related to one or the other culture, then we can rather get to such a differentiated dialogue and a deeper understanding. So coming back to to the terrorist attack in Vienna, I mean, by people working together who are against terrorist attacks, and those are many, and they can be secular, they can be Christians, and they can be Muslims or whatever they are, but Buddhists, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, and now really to come to the end, I think also when we think about cultural and artistic productions, they can be used for all the aims that were described now, and also by Milena, as she showed with this novel about where the Armenian is the bad guy. Yeah? They can emphasize cultural conflicts, cultural differences, the superior of Western culture, all lead to transversal cultural relations. And this does not have to be directly linked to the intentions of those doing that. There is, so I think what is needed is a lot of reflection and self-reflection in a very concrete way, but maybe this is something I can get to later in my second statement. So thank you.
Thank you, Monika, very much, especially for this elaboration on the conceptual level on some notions of culture and also some culture-related concepts. And especially thank you for reflecting upon what has been said yesterday at the conference. I think that this aspect is also very important because it keeps really a kind of feeling of dialogue. And I have to say also that the context that you were mentioning and these examples of terrorist attacks, this is of course always important to show that we as academics really refer to the world we live in and to the concrete actions, whether it is a homegrown terrorism like this example or some others. And now I would like to welcome at our panel also Ambassador CYNTHIA Schneider with an extensive experience really also in teaching and publishing and organizing different initiatives in culture diplomacy. So CYNTHIA, first of all, thank you for joining us with this extreme time zone difference. At this very moment, as far as I know, you co-direct this laboratory for global performance in politics at Georgetown, and also the Mali-based Timbuktu Renaissance, as well as many, many other initiatives. So please, could you share with us your ideas on how culture can also be part of the solution and not necessarily the problem itself when it comes to conflicts? Please, CYNTHIA.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to join you. Emilia, could I have the slides, please? It's really a pleasure to be with all of you. And I think we have many similar perspectives to these problems. And I look forward to the questions and answers, though, because I know I come from a country that's raising a lot of questions these days, and I'm happy to do my best to answer them. Could we have the next slide, please? I want to suggest to you, as others have inferred in different ways, that culture can be the problem, but it can also be the answer. And this is something that a friend of mine who runs a NGO for the empowerment of women said to me once. And I think Afghanistan can be a great example of this. You're looking here at two contrasting images, both from March of 2019. On the left, you see Zahra Alam. She was the first woman to win the extremely popular singing contest, Afghan Star. And on the right, you see the Taliban delegation going into the talks in Doha, Qatar, for quote unquote peace. Now let's just look at what each of these images represents and then look at their context. So Afghan Star, and like many programs around the world, is modeled on American Idol. So you might say, oh, yuck, Americanization, but not at all. In the program, they sing only Afghan songs. It's played a huge role in the revival of music in Afghanistan, which you may remember was banned by the Taliban during its rule. And very importantly, that contest and others like it, like, for example, Arabs Got Talent, are meritocracies. They're spaces and public spaces where people advance on the basis of their own individual talent, not their parents, not their ethnic group, not how much money they have, just their own talent, which sadly in Afghanistan and many other countries is a rarity. So this young woman, 18 years old, from the Hazara minority living in a Taliban-controlled area, was the person voted on, the winners are selected by popular voting, was the person voted on by the largest number of the Afghan people watching the program. And at least a third of the population watches the finals. So it's a lot of people. So what does that say about the country? What does that say about where that country is going? A real openness to women, despite all of the challenges for women that certainly exist in that country. At the same time, what does the United States government choose to do? We choose, they, I have to say they for the Trump administration, chose to negotiate with a terrorist group that represents a small fraction of the population that unfortunately has increased its control across the country, but it's still just a fraction of the country. And a terrorist group who, if they were in charge, would ban music and would not allow Zahra Alam out of the house. So what country are we talking about? Culture can be something that is liberating the people of Afghanistan, but culture, and I'm going to use this for the Taliban, their way of life and the norms and the restrictions in their way of life can also prevent any progress. Next slide, please. And the Taliban also recognizes, as do other terrorist groups around the world, ISIS is another example, recognizes the power of culture. You see on the right, extraordinary man, Ahmed Sarmast, who founded the Afghan National Institute of Music, an absolutely top-rate educational institution that gives a 360-degree education, not only music, but a full education as well. Half of their population are children quite literally taken off the streets, whose parents are paid to allow them to go to school. And he has been particularly a pioneer in educating women in Afghanistan. And he's launched the first all-female orchestra as part of ANIM, the Afghan National Institute of Music. Female conductor, all-female musicians, and they've played all over the world, including at the World Economic Forum. But you see also Dr. Sarmast on the left recuperating from a Taliban bomb attack on the French consulate, the French Cultural Center in Kabul, when the Music Institute was performing there. And it was a bomb that very specifically was targeting him. Fortunately, he recovered his hearing, and he went right back to school. So this is an interesting thing, I think, that extremists recognize the power of culture, and they try to destroy it in many ways, whether it's cultural heritage, such as the destruction of Palmyra, or living culture, such as music. And yet, as has been referenced already by the other speakers, and yet the forces for peace, for good, don't recognize this power that culture has. May I have the next slide, please? I myself take these very simple but very powerful words of Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian Nobel laureate, as a kind of mantra. And I think they are so true. And the idea that culture humanizes, that it helps to understand difference, helps to make us understand people we think might be our enemies, whereas politics does just the opposite, and kind of forces us, obliges us to see things in black and white. I want to look at with you now, may I have the next slide, please, at a couple of examples of culture humanizing and breaking down barriers that probably couldn't have been breached, any other way. There's a famous example of ping pong diplomacy between the United States and China that opened the way for the recognition of China by President Nixon. And, this was something, it kind of looked like an accident, but it clearly wasn't. It was in some way engineered, that the Chinese ping pong team and the American ping pong team were both playing in a tournament in Japan. And the American player, by mistake, and it literally was a mistake, somehow wandered onto a Chinese bus instead of the bus he was looking for. And there he was welcomed by the top Chinese player. And later the next day, they exchanged gifts. And, within literally weeks, there were plans for the American team to travel to China. And later, of course, American officials would. I want to emphasize, can we have the next slide, please? I want to emphasize the actual sport that it was, ping pong. Ping pong is not really a big deal in the United States. People play it at home, but we don't get really all excited about our ping pong team. But I mean, bravo them, but it's just not like football or baseball or something else. But that's what made it perfect, because it is really important in China. And so it was already a kind of form of deference to the Chinese, and made them feel empowered, and was the perfect door opener. And in recognition of that, on the 30-year anniversary of the initial ping pong diplomacy, you see Henry Kissinger engaging in the game of ping pong with his counterpart. Another example of a sport like this that can open doors would be wrestling with Iran. We've had American wrestling teams traveling to Iran, where they are received like national heroes. I am sorry to say, I have no idea who our champion wrestlers are, but the Iranians do. And they welcome them with open arms. Wrestling is the most important sport in Iran. And this is, I think, and this is maybe something we can talk about in the Q&A, this is such an untapped area in the hostile and unnecessarily hostile relations between the United States and Iran, where there's a tremendous connection between the Iranian people and the American people. It's just the governments that foster the hatred between the two. And I have to say, this is something that extends across Democrats and Republicans. There's, such excitement around the Obama nuclear deal, and certainly it's better to have a deal than not to have a deal. But there was not one single item of education or cultural exchange in that deal. It was as if Iran was populated only by nuclear reactors. a tremendous lost opportunity, and I hope the second time around the same will not be true. May I have the next slide, please? Again, culture played a huge role in the eventual breakup of the Soviet Union, and also in negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And jazz in particular was important here. And this is Dave Brubeck, the great jazz musician who you see on the left, shaking hands with Gorbachev at the summit in the 1980s, with President Reagan looking on. May I have the Takes the A Train refers to the song that he played. May I have the next slide, please? This is something the Secretary of State, George Shultz, said to Dave Brubeck late that night or the next day. So you had a kind of stalemate in the negotiations and a lot of hostility. And then you have a dinner with a fabulous jazz musician performing. And lo and behold, both Reagan and Gorbachev, the American delegation and the Russian delegation, everybody's tapping their feet to the music and enjoying it. They found something in common. And just that little step, just like the ping pong or the wrestling, that little step humanized the other side, and they were able to have productive conversations. May I have the next slide, please? And this music also played a tremendous role in opening up Eastern Europe, as you all know. And here it was more rock music necessarily than, but jazz as well. And I'm talking here about an American musician, Bruce Springsteen, but I want to emphasize that really the change happened by, I think, the local musicians on the ground who learned themselves to play rock music and then disseminated it amongst all their friends. But this concert, the Bruce Springsteen concert in East Berlin, I think was one of the great miscalculations of all time. He was actually invited to perform by the East German authorities. And they reasoned that they were tired of the East German youth going to the wall. I'm not quite sure what happened to the slide. Maybe we could bring it back. But anyway, you saw it. They were tired of the East German youth going to the wall to listen to concerts that were taking place in West Berlin. And people in West Berlin were cooperating by turning speakers towards the east so people could hear the music in East Berlin. So the East German authorities reasoned, well, we'll give them their own concert and that will be enough. You know, they'll have one concert of their own and then they'll be just fine. And so they invited, so again, this is not the US government, this is the East German government, invited Bruce Springsteen to perform not at the wall, but right in the middle of East Berlin. And there were over 300,000 people at this concert. And Bruce Springsteen, I've got to say, a real class act and a real ambassador, welcomed the crowd speaking German. And I really encourage you to look it up on YouTube, just Bruce Springsteen East Berlin concert. You will hear him performing the Chimes of Freedom, which the whole crowd is singing along with, but he introduces it speaking in German and says, I'm not here to, you know, for political reasons. I'm here to play music, you know, for everyone to enjoy. And, you know, I hope that in the future we will all be able to enjoy this together. But of course, it had the exact opposite effect that the East German authorities intended it to. And this is something that's important to think about, these public cultural events. This wasn't enough. The 300,000 people who went there wanted to be able to do this any and every day. And of course, it was just over a year before the wall came down altogether. But this gave them a taste of freedom in their own place, and made it much, much harder to go back to the very authoritarian East German system. And I want to add, you see in this picture somebody waving American flag. That is not like some US government propaganda. That happened, you know, spontaneously. And again, Bruce Springsteen was there as a private citizen. He wasn't representing the government. May I have the next slide, please? And this will be my last slide, and I'm very open to discussing any of these and other ideas in the Q&A period. I have seen in myself this power of culture to bring people together and to heal differences. I've seen this on the ground in Timbuktu in Mali. And this is what you see here, a concert that took place about a year ago in Mali. You may remember that Timbuktu and the northern half of Mali was occupied by extremists in 2012. They were expelled and the occupation ended in 2013, about a year later, when French-led forces expelled these Al-Qaeda linked extremists. But they haven't disappeared altogether. They're still around in the desert, unfortunately. Tourism has not been able to return to Timbuktu, which was at the absolute mainstay of this historic town, once a center of civilization on a par with Florence at the same time period. And so you had a historic town that is tremendously important, not just in Mali, but all over Africa, in really desperate shape, no economic drivers at all. And the population very divided, because when Timbuktu was occupied, they were foreign Al-Qaeda linked extremists linked with some Tuareg separatists who led the occupation, but locals joined. And this was something that came up in yesterday's discussion also. What are the drivers towards extremism? How do extremists recruit? And my experience in Mali is that it doesn't have anything to do with any kind of fundamentalist approach to Islam at all. It simply has to do with money, that people are so desperately poor, and thanks to foreign funding, these extremists have money. And they offer people money so they can support their families. They offered people guns so they could be like this very powerful person. And for example, the man who was convicted of the first conviction ever of destruction of cultural heritage as a war crime, he destroyed the tombs in Timbuktu. He was somebody who was just sort of an occasional school teacher in Timbuktu, not someone who commanded a great deal of respect, but someone who was offered a gun and money and joined. So I think this is a whole other problem. You know, it's not so much that you need to undo the influence of the philosophy. You need to enable people to be able to get jobs. But this occupation left Timbuktu very divided. Who were the people who had joined with the occupiers? Were they still in touch with them? Could they, you know, because there are people are attacked, there are kidnappings, there are murders even from these extremists still in Timbuktu. So there was a great deal of unease and suspicion in this place that had always been known for its hospitality and openness and plurality and tolerance. And so the mayor and the imam and the governor of the region came to us, the Timbuktu Renaissance, and I work in the Timbuktu Renaissance with two Malians, one of whom, Mani Ansar, is the founder of the famous Festival au Désert, the enormous festival that used to take place in Timbuktu, and is a beloved and renowned music producer in the city and from Timbuktu himself. These officials came to us and said, what we really need are public concerts. Now, you know, if you say that to your standard mediator, peacemaker, policymaker, they'll say, what? you know, you have this place that was torn apart by extremists and you want to have concerts. But yes, that is what works in this place, because in Mali, largely oral society, music is the way, you know, the tradition of their griot, and music is the way that people communicate about the past, the present, and the future. Music from Mali is the root of blues and rock and roll in the United States and all over the world through slavery, through slaves who came from Western Africa. And the way we were told to bring people together and begin to heal these divisions and rebuild social cohesion and trust would be to offer public concerts that people would come to. And so that's what we did with funding. I want to emphasize we have funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, which is a government organization in the United States. And I really want to call them out because they recognize they are not a cultural organization at all. They support democracy around the world, but they recognize the power of culture. And I've had many, many conversations with them, and we've written it 100 times over in our grant applications. Every time it's, but tell us again exactly why concerts. But we have seen how holding these public concerts bring people together. Neighbors literally see each other in a way they hadn't before. They start to talk, they start to make plans together. They remember what life was like before the occupation, because remember, an important thing I neglected to say, these extremists also, when they occupied, they banned music. And in Mali, people, that was just unimaginable. One of the most famous musicians, Fatimata Walid Umar, said, they want to ban music, they're going to have to kill me first. It was just unimaginable. But why did they do that? Because they understood, these extremists, they understood that music was the foundation of identity. Music is what held people together. So if you take it away, you weaken the population. And that was their goal, to weaken and dominate. Our approach is the flip of that. If taking music away weakens people, then bringing it back strengthens them and strengthens the society and gives them a vision for the future and, you know, the strength to rebuild it. You know, it's a very small thing, but I remember I ended up hosting our first concert there. And the next morning I was heading to the airport, and the driver for the hotel said to me, you know, thank you so much for that concert. It's the first night since the occupation that I have slept soundly. I'd forgotten what it was like. And it meant so much to be able to be there with my neighbors, you know, enjoying this music. So we continue Timbuktu Renaissance. We continue, not during COVID, but as soon as it ends, we will continue again to hold public concerts in Timbuktu. And we've now been asked by NED to extend these activities to neighboring countries as well. May I have the final slide? So I'm happy to answer any questions about this or other projects that I'm working on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, especially for bringing up also sports as part of not only culture diplomacy, but more as within the framework of people-to-people relations, and especially for stressing the importance of public cultural events and artistic practices in this relation. I'm sure that we will have in the Q&A session much to discuss about it. And now, finally, a panelist to contribute also to a more kind of a gender balance of the panel. And of course, not only that, Mr. Dag Nylander comes with an outstanding experience also in mediation, having held several diplomatic positions for the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So Dag, shortly, I would appreciate if you could share with us your view on culture as CBM, its confidence building measures in negotiation. It's a kind of different language from what we people from culture talk, but I'm sure it will be very useful for our audience to hear. Dag, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ljiljana. It's a great pleasure being invited to this panel. Thank you very much to the Conflux Center, China Foreign Affairs University, and the University of Arts in Belgrade. How small things make for big differences, supporting conflict resolution and reconciliation processes by cultural means and instruments. Like some of the other speakers, I started out when preparing for this panel looking at the expression culture. What does it really mean? And I tried to dissect it. I wasn't very successful, so I left that to one side. So you'll have to forgive me if I approach this from somewhat blurry platform. I think there are various ways of approaching the thematic of this particular panel. Let me just express two ways of approaching this panel. Small things in mediation, conflict prevention, and resolution can relate to small existing elements of cultural differences, making a big difference at the table, often negative, but not always. Or it can mean the active introduction by the mediator of small things, often cultural, having a positive impact and making a big difference. So I will mix the two approaches slightly in my presentation. So I will focus on situation with smaller cultural differences between parties and on small cultural fixes or confidence building measures, CBMs, as Ljiljana pointed out. On cultural fixes, I do not particularly like the expression confidence building measures, CBMs, or rather I do not particularly like the concept of CBMs as it is being presented in literature about mediation. I often find that parties and mediators spend too much energy on identifying, agreeing on, and implementing so-called confidence building measures, often unsuccessfully, unfortunately, rather than focusing on the key issues at hand. I often find it more useful to look in retrospect at something that you've done, a process that you've been a part of, and then trying to identify what have been the measures that have helped build confidence between the parties in the process, between the parties and the mediator, etc., rather than having CBMs as a obligatory stepping stone in any process. So first, let's build confidence by identifying measures, and then we can get to the core of things. So I will draw primarily on my experience as a mediator, a facilitator in my presentation, both for representing the Norwegian government, representing the United Nations Secretary General, and now lately as director of the Norwegian Center for Conflict Resolution, NOREF. So one obvious lesson learned clearly, and this was also touched upon in the panels yesterday, is that everyone needs to start listening when they try to resolve problems. Stop talking, start listening. If people could only do that more, a lot could be done. So really put yourself in the shoes of the other. Try to understand not only the positions and interests of the other party. If you do that in a sincere and thorough way, you will also unearth any cultural difference that makes reaching across difficult, and you will be able to identify ways to bridge differences, often through cultural means. So we heard about deep or active listening in some of yesterday's interventions, which I found particularly interesting. And then a note of caution. There is a gliding scale from when diverging positions and interests is just that, diverging positions and interests, and when one party's perception of the other party's positions and interests is misinformed by cultural difference. And again, I think the tool to apply here is deep or active listening. Another note of caution, the question, when are we just talking about regular human interaction? So regular human interaction is always influenced by culture in one way or the other. There is always a cultural context to dialogue. So there is a limit to what extreme you would want to stretch the notion of culture to explain differences or use it as a building block to construct bridges between opposing positions. So first, some words about cultural differences and using culture to bridge those differences within the same country or the same society. So I worked with the Colombian peace process for more than a decade. I worked with two Colombian illegal armed groups, the FARC and the ELN. And as you will recall, the FARC and the government of Colombia signed a comprehensive peace agreement in 2016, which is currently being implemented. And I spent the better part of 5 years facilitating the talks with the FARC. So we started out with an exploratory phase in 2010, a secret negotiating phase in 2011, where the agenda and the rules of the game were established. And then lastly, a drawn out and almost permanent negotiating table was launched in Oslo in 2012, and then subsequently moved to Havana, Cuba, where Norway continued to serve as a facilitator together with the Cuban government. So I spent maybe 50% of my time in Havana over those 5 years. So I got to know the parties very well. So what did I find that is relevant to the topic of today? Firstly, that the Colombian government and the FARC didn't always understand each other very well. Even if they spoke the same language, they used different kind of language to talk about the same issues. But slowly, a joint vocabulary emerged at the table and between the two delegations. One example on, and I think this is relevant to all kinds of peace negotiations. You have to really set aside quite some time looking at the history of the country or the countries in question or the groups in question, that really dig into the historic context. So in Colombia, it took some time before both delegations understood that they really needed to go through all these motions and spend the necessary time on their respective history telling. What really happened in Colombia in 1948, what really happened during the war on drugs, what was the role of Pablo Escobar in Colombia, what was the truth about the paramilitaries, etc. And slowly it emerged, and both parties understood that it was not really a question of agreeing on history. Agreeing on history would be impossible, but they needed to sit there and listen to each other and understand the perspective of the other delegation. And only then was it possible to start identifying a path forward. In the peace talks in Colombia, there were also elements of urban versus rural culture and language. So schematically, you could say that the Colombian government was more urban and the FARC guerrilla was more rural in its history and their vocabulary and in their culture. There were some elements of the two delegations, even if they were from the same culture and the same country, they have been somewhat isolated from each other. And maybe you could say that a different kind of subculture had emerged over the years. The government was effective and businesslike, whereas the FARC was slower in its decision-making and seemingly more intransigent. But slowly, getting the right people to talk to each other was happening. And we often heard the expression, this and that person of the government delegation understands the guerrilla. He really understands what they're saying. He gets what is not being said, what is being said between the lines, and vice versa. This particular FARC commander went to university in Bogota. He understands the modern vocabulary of the government representatives. So bringing the right personalities together to help build those bridges between the two parties was something that we worked hard on. And interestingly, I think the peace process in Colombia really made an important leap forward when we brought the military together. You know, the military commanders of the FARC and the military commanders of the Colombian government together, because they really spoke the same language. They had joint experiences from the field, and they found each other in, it might be a stretch to call it mutual respect, but there was a professional understanding between the two. So what about using the small things? And forgive me for calling them small things, but I'm referring to the agenda here. The small things of cultural CBMs, confidence building measures. In Colombia, we applied a couple of things. For example, football as culture. Shouldn't be any discussion whether football is culture or not. So back in 2011, during the exploratory phase, top secret meeting at a small Caribbean island between representatives from the FARC and the government, there was one night on TV, there was a match between Colombia and Venezuela. And that was a huge confidence builder, or at least an element to get the two parties into the same room, looking at the same screen, and sharing the experience of watching football. So this is one example. Secondly, another cultural CBM, another sport, bicycling. I was flying from Washington DC to Havana, no direct flights at that time, and I brought a bicycle from Washington to Havana, and that particular object, the bicycle, became something that the parties could unite around, and particularly with the FARC. I used it as a confidence builder. When I was not in Havana, when I was traveling back to Norway for some time off, I left the bicycle in the hands of the FARC delegation, and they would use it riding around the small lake that we were living, and it was an important distraction from the core issues, the hardcore issues at the table. Thirdly, what I often talk about this as salmon and Vikings, and I think this is an expression of, often you focus on the culture, the joint culture, what sets them apart in terms of cultural identity of the parties, but there is also the culture that sets the mediator apart from the parties. I think this is an issue of interest, and one of the presenters yesterday, I believe it was the keynote speaker, discussed asked the question rather, who mediates best? United Nations, NGOs, INGOs, small states, big states, former presidents, personalities, etc. But my point here is really that, being a mediator and coming from a distinct culture also brings something to the table. Often there is a difference between the mediator and the parties in a question. And how does the different culture of the mediator compare to the parties? How does it influence his ability to mediate? So the culture is not only about the parties and the cultural context of the parties, but it's also about the culture that the mediator brings to the table. And then fourthly, briefly, and I was reminded about this example when listening to CYNTHIA on ping-pong diplomacy, etc. And during Havana, in parallel with the peace talks between the FARC and the Colombian government, there was a process. There was a process going on between the U.S. administration and Cuba, and at some point there was a state visit by the U.S. President Barack Obama flew to Havana. It was a big event, obviously, and there was this baseball match with a U.S. and a Cuban baseball team. Obviously, baseball is huge in the U.S. and enormous in Cuba. And you have this interesting photo. Unfortunately, I do not have it with me, so I can bring it up on the screen. But it's a shot taken from the field, and you can see in the first row you can see the Cuban president Raúl Castro. You can see the U.S. president Barack Obama as an expression of a CBM, or using cultural means to resolve political issues. But then in the background of that picture, further up on the stand, you will see the FARC delegation at the same baseball match. So it's an expression not only of US-Cuba relations, but it's also an expression of the supporting role that the US was playing for the peace talks in Colombia, in Cuba. So these are some experiences from Colombia. Let me now turn to a couple of other examples. I served as the Secretary General's personal representative to the border controversy between Venezuela and the neighboring country Guyana. So I was mediating an end to that controversy. I have to say I was not successful in mediating an agreement between the two. So the controversy now find itself in the hands of the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which has just recently ruled that it has jurisdiction to try the case. So Guyana and Venezuela are, even though they are neighbors, they are supremely different in many ways. One is, lack of a better expression, sort of with its British colonial history and its strong Caribbean cultural feats, and the other one more Latin American and continental looking than the other, that being Venezuela, obviously. So one of the things that we were looking at was, how, and the parties were really very much far apart. And one of the things that we were looking at was, how can we find a confidence building measure at the outset to bring the parties closer together? And then we looked at Guyana, which is a cricket playing nation, partly because of its strong influence of Indian culture and British culture, obviously, and then Venezuela, again a baseball playing country. So, coming from the northern parts of Europe, not knowing anything about cricket or baseball, looking at, well, is there something here that we can sort of look into and maybe merge or find some kind of CBM that can help us out? And I have to tell you, I was not very successful in that. I think we broached the issue with both the Venezuelans and the Guyanese, and it was not moving anywhere, unfortunately. Another example of culture in mediation and negotiation, it might be even more on the sidelines of the thematic of this panel, but anyway, I will mention it. Norway was, in 2019, Norway was mediating the political conflict between Venezuelan President Maduro and the opposition, and it was really a mediation between two competing or opposing presidents. You have you really had two presidents supported by different parts of society and different parts of the international community. And here we had the US being a very important factor in the Venezuelan talks. Norway was facilitating or mediating the negotiations. US was supporting the Venezuelan opposition strongly, and the Americans were looking at the negotiations from a distance, but still coordinating closely with the opposition and keeping in close contact with the mediator, Norway. So we were talking to the State Department, we were talking to the National Security Council. It was not easy to sort of get the international actors on the same page and get them to support the political talks that were taking place partially in Oslo and partially in Barbados. And one example of where, the external, not the mediator, not the facilitator, but an important external actor, the United States was misreading a cultural aspect was when they publicly during the talks were promising Venezuelan military commanders amnesty and preferential treatment if they left left President Maduro. Obviously, this was a huge miscalculation on part of the Americans. They misunderstood the culture and the pride of the Venezuelan military. So rather than managing to splinter them off, I think the Americans succeeded in uniting them in their continued support of Maduro. So let me close by the following. Going back to one of the interventions yesterday, where it was said that something to the extent that when the elites negotiate, for example, foreign minister to foreign minister, they often have a joint refined language, you know, and a mutual understanding of the rules of the game. So culture becomes less important. I think this is partially true, but you have to also remember that even if there are elites talking the same language, negotiating, they always need to think about the constituency and the people on the ground, where an agreement really is going to be implemented, understood, and supported. So going back to Colombia and the peace talks with the FARC, I think one example here is when you misread the people back home. Inclusion of women after 5 years of talks in Havana, you know, receiving expert inputs on all kinds of topics, but included on gender inclusion, gay rights, etc. The comprehensive agreement that was agreed after 5 years in 2016 was loaded with so-called gender-sensitive language and language that talked about the inclusion of women, equal rights between men and women, gay rights, etc. It was all beautifully done and beautifully laid out in the very comprehensive agreement. But it was done to such an extent that conservative and Catholic part of Colombian society did not accept it. The opponents of the peace agreement, with the support of these very powerful religious actors and large parts of Colombian society, basically said that the agreement was a threat to traditional family values of Colombia. And this was indeed one of the more effective arguments against the peace agreement. And this was obviously a mistake by the negotiators. They didn't think carefully enough about the language they were using when they drafted the agreement, and not sufficiently about an important part of the constituency back home in Colombia. So this is an example of how, even if you have elites negotiating, you always have to think about the cultural context back home, where the agreement, after all, is going to be implemented eventually. So these were the elements I wanted to draw your attention to. So forgive me for my ramblings. Thank you very much for your attention.
Doug, thank you very much. Thank you for bringing into the panel the notion of the rules of the game. I think to talk about the principles is almost equally important as also to share with us the insights basically from the field work. And now we basically are moving to the next part of our panel. I would now encourage our dear audience to already put some questions. We have already some comments and some questions, but I would just in this moment also take a chance to kind of reflect upon what has been said. So as we heard, culture really provides a very powerful means to engage people in issues that may otherwise fail basically to see or even choose to ignore. Either these are issues of community, ethnicity, religion, as we heard, gender, and the conflict as such. So culture can do it also in a way that is both sensitive, I would say, and honest. And having this in mind, I would invite again Professor MILENA, who have worked a lot as a culture policy expert for UNESCO and done missions across the world, and also gave lectures at various universities. So MILENA, you have devoted your whole career to supporting the civil society voices and initiatives and bringing up this bottom-up approach to cultural policies. So bearing in mind that, what would be, according to you, the most important assets for intercultural mediation?
Thank you, Ljiljana. I really was not only defender of participation of civil society in all spheres of public life, political, cultural, and so on. I was also activist myself, and since first possibility to create your own organization, even during socialism, in 81, I created with friends some NGO called Science of Culture. So we try to do our best. But I think that without participation of wide social forces and civil societies, the real changes will hardly happen in spite of the agreements, because agreements, they are done in between political elites. Political elites also change. Political elites also follow what is convenient for them to stay on power. Exactly as Doug said, even the discourse of the agreement have to be adapted to be accepted, for example, by church as a strong power in many societies, many not in all, probably not in all, but in many. So what are the assets? Today, neoliberal education forces us to speak about transversal skills as the key for future employment for everything. I would introduce one so conservative notion of knowledge. My French students, for example, in Lyon, and I underline those are students at cultural departments, they cannot respond to me on a very simple question. When slavery has been abolished in France? And usually they would be stuck and say, at least during French Revolution, Human Rights Charter, and so on. So that means that none of them knows what France did to Haiti and what are the real, because the Haiti slaves raised the revolution during French Revolution and Napoleon sent army and so on. How they can learn that if they do not learn that at school in public policies? Only if there are brave theaters within civil society, not public theaters, because public theaters are following repertories that are convenient for public policies. And then they can stage Heiner Müller, for example, performance about that. So cultural NGOs, they have enormous importance, not only in activism, but in raising issues, but the real issues of social misunderstanding, cultural misunderstanding, embedded racism within each society, which is, from my standpoint, due to basic lack of knowledge. We don't know even, for example, in Serbia, there is a common stereotype that we never ever participated in any aggressive conquering war. That's one story, one narrative. Second narrative, of the same group is that Serbia was the greatest in the time of King Milutin and King Dusan, those kings that were ruling over Greeks, Albanians, Bulgarians, so conquering territory, leading wars that were conquering and so on. And you can just think why, how come that people cannot even connect simple things? Because they lack knowledge, they lack critical thinking capacities. And I have to underline that even in EU, in this strategy, which was created, I think, around 12 or something for education, the word critical thinking was not even mentioned, only skills, abilities, skills, and so on. So yes, I think that readiness of civil society to do things in conflict zones, in tough situations, to take on themselves the burden. For example, Women in Black, together with art organizations such as Dach Theater, they were the only ones to take seriously women oral history statements and create projects that for the first time made to people, how to say, awareness that there are stories that are completely similar on Muslim side, on Croat side, on Serbian side, and that especially if you are a woman, you had to pass the similar kind of torture, humiliation, etc., etc. Patriotic Hypermarket, for the theater people who did this performance in they were stuck with the fact that both communities they were dealing with, Serbian and Albanian, were completely shocked hearing the stories of the other as a victim, because each side was completely embedded the story that only they are victims and the others are perpetrators. So I would say that that's something, and finish to leave people a chance to ask other questions also, that civil society has in fact enormous roles today in the time of illiberal governance and so on, because public policies are avoiding conflictual, dissonant issues and so on. People are choosing. Mass media are making fake news. We haven't touched this issue, but half of those conflicts, in fact, for Rwanda, it's clear that it was fueled by radio. And in our country, former Yugoslavia, it was fueled by press. Unfortunately, free press. That was the paradox, that it was freedom of the press that enabled tabloidization and fueling ethnic conflict as cultural conflict. And to respond to the question of Milos Strugar, who came through Q&A about how we can avoid a risk that cultural event, for example, one festival like Guča in Serbia or Sinjska Alka in Croatia, being misused by politicians for their promotion and so on. That is in fact exactly the place for entering the civil society, that for these kind of festivals, the other should be invited. So as in Guča, not only French trumpet ensembles should be invited, but Croatians, Bulgarians from neighboring country, so that it becomes, okay, festival of Serbian trumpet music, but open to others. The same Sinjska Alka, it is a festival of the freedom and the conquest of freedom battle against Turks, but to invite also others, neighboring, to come with their traditions of similar, let's say, freedom festivities and so on. That can be one possibility, not to monopolize and to misuse the ethnic cultural festivity, which is definitely each of them positive, but to use it for the negative purposes.
Thank you very much, Professor Milena. And now, since I have the information that Doug would have to leave a little bit earlier, and I hope that the rest of you have enough time because we have a lot of questions. Now, I will just read out the question for Doug. Ethnicity is often mobilized for political purposes. So how to avoid a risk that cultural events such as ethnic festivals, remembrance days, or ethnic-based educational institutions are in fact used by politicians to create boundary makers between groups and communities? It is a question for you. It's I'm interested because you really come from a bit different angle. We don't have the author of the question, so Doug, please, if you could answer.
Thank you very much for that question. I'm not sure if I'm able to give a good answer to it, but I was reminded by one of the tools that was applied in the Colombian peace process. One of the cultural tools that was applied in the Colombian peace process was the following. When I spoke about elites earlier and elites negotiating in Havana, that is partially true. It was the leadership of the FARC and a high-profile government delegation, but the process also took care, both parties and the facilitators, to design a very inclusive process. So there were a number of mechanisms that were put in place in order to bring people to Havana to meet with the parties face to face, to give inputs to the peace talks. But also there were established tools for everyone really in Colombia to electronically make their inputs to the peace process. Have concrete proposals, civil society, women's groups, individuals, etc. And one particular inclusion mechanism was that of including victims in the peace talks. So the parties early understood or agreed, initially tacitly, but then eventually in a more express way, of saying that the purpose of these negotiations, why we are doing is really to put the victims in the center of our efforts. So even though the agenda was comprehensive and touched upon very complicated political, technical issues from many aspects of Colombian society, the victims were at the center of the efforts. So this was something that the parties used repeatedly, and a particular mechanism was set up to bring delegations of victims of government violence, victims of guerrilla violence, victims of paramilitary violence, etc., to bring these groups from Colombia to Havana. And I remember vividly one example when the Cubans facilitated a very small meeting between a small Colombian community that had been the victim of a terrible FARC attack 20 years back. And this small group of victims was brought into a room in Havana, and the FARC delegation came in, and there was a very touching ceremony with cultural expressions. And that was the first step towards moving both the FARC and the government delegation and the peace process really from Havana and back to Colombia and into the communities, and in this particular instance into the community that have been a victim of this particular attack. And what we saw there on the Pacific coast of Colombia, we had to fly in in helicopters, there are no roads. You know, the only roads there are waterways, so people get around by boat. And we flew in there, visited this little community together with a representative of the international community, the FARC and the government. And we saw some very touching and very important plays, or one play really, a theatrical play, illustrating what had happened that particular day 20 years back. And then I understood that this had been their way of dealing with their past. This was an important way of reconciling with the past before the peace process started over the past 20 years. But it was also a very important mechanism for them to tell the FARC and the government, and by extension the larger Colombian society, about the reconciliation efforts that they had been undertaken, and the importance of including victims and that particular attack in the work going forward. So that was another example of how culture was used actively in the Colombian peace process.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us at this panel. We're looking forward to some future occasions for conversation. And now I would like to share a question for Ambassador Cynthia Schneider. What level of impact on cultural diplomacy, and can it be considered as any form of cultural diplomacy? These spontaneous cultural phenomena that spread and gained a considerable popularity in many and unexpected places, such as Depeche Mode in the countries behind the Iron Curtain, especially in Poland during the 80s, for instance, or Sixto Rodriguez, Sugar Man in South African Republic during the apartheid, etc. And maybe, Cynthia, you can reflect upon also some comments from chat.
Am I meant to see the comments from the chat? Are you going to tell me what they are, or just
no? You can just answer this question, and maybe if there's enough time, we can come back.
Okay. No, I'm happy to answer the chat questions too. You know, I am just not really a big person on definitions. And I'm not even really a big person on the word cultural diplomacy, because it right away sort of implies the elites, and you know, diplomacy right away makes you think of states. And so I actually like the term the British use, cultural relations, which I think is a much more comprehensive term and implies a little bit less of the imposition of, you know, country A using its cultural diplomacy to achieve something with country B, because I really think a purpose of all this is really building relations and building trust and building understanding and truly humanizing the other. And so, you know, when we think about the role of culture in international relations between people today, I'd like to just bring something up that has been alluded to but not really mentioned so much, and that is, you know, just the context that we're operating in the 21st century. It's so different from the 20th century. You know, there was a mention, and thank you, Doug, for bringing women's voices and victims' voices. You know, if you look at the image of the people at the Dayton Accords, I mean, it is amazing. Just one big beefy white man next to another big beefy white man. Into that category, I'm also including our master negotiator, Richard Holbrooke. And it's like they're like cookie cutters. And it's no surprise that there were no measures of culture or education or history or understanding. There was the Herculean task of ceasing the fighting. But I hope that we understand today that peace is not achieved by ceasing fighting, that peace is achieved by deeper understandings between people, which begins maybe with a shared understanding of history, or at least a discussion of the differences and an attempt to come to an understanding, and then some kind of agreement on priorities for the future. And this is all accessible because we don't live in a world where only elites talk to elites. We live in a world where, thanks to the internet and social media, citizen journalism, the rise of non-state actors, good and bad, we live in a world where this is all accessible. It's not a mystery what people are thinking in other countries. We can find it out. And so to me, that shifts kind of what one can do and can most effectively do in the realm of culture from the traditional 20th century model of country A, whether it's the United States or Serbia or Norway, whatever, sending its people and cultural products around the world. The United States still does that. And, sometimes it's a good idea, but I think a more effective approach is to think in terms of leveraging local voices rather than sending American ones, because it is the local voices that have the much stronger impact. So, for example, take something we haven't talked about yet, take hip hop, like jazz, kind of the successor to jazz, something that was created, invented in the United States and then adopted all over the world, created out of a sense of disenfranchisement, of discontent with the system, of rebelling against the system by Blacks in New York, rebelling against the system they lived under in a very oppressive way. But that struck a chord then all over the world. And people, as you know, have adopted it to their situation, their language. So, for example, the response of the United States was to initiate a hip hop program and send American hip hop artists around the world. Well, we don't have put as much money in culture as we did in the old days. It's partially because the CIA doesn't fund it anymore. Arguably a bad thing. I wish we could have the money without the CIA. But anyway, we don't have the money we had before. So we're not sending the same level of artists. And meanwhile, around the world, they're artists of top caliber. They don't need kind of mid-level American artists coming. But what could be useful, and what I'm happy to say the State Department is adjusting to and understanding and trying to work more in this way, is advice and expertise on distribution and production and commercialization. So rather than sending American voices around the world, leveraging local voices and using, because there still is know-how from, and certainly not just America, you can find it in South Africa, you can find it in India, you can find it, all over the place, but know-how in distribution and production and just marketing, enabling the local cultural voices to reach their own audiences is tremendously important. And there have been some fantastic projects of this type. And that means also listening to the local voices. There's been a lot of talk about listening. I'll take two examples. One, the Arab Spring. If policymakers had spent more time listening to cultural voices, then they wouldn't have been so surprised by the Arab Spring. Anyone who paid any attention to, could be hip hop, it could be novels. Take the most popular novel published in Egypt in the 21st century, The Yacubian Building, also turned into a film, translated into every language. There you have it very clearly in black and white that every sector of society in Egypt couldn't advance, was absolutely stymied by the endemic corruption in that country. and repression. So if you paid attention to the cultural voices, you would say, why isn't there a revolution in this region? Not, help, why is there a revolution? Where did this come from? Gee, they've had dictators for decades. Where is this coming from? The cultural voices tell you what people are thinking. And I do believe they are key to what I hope will evolve, and I certainly hope it will evolve in my country, as a new approach to diplomacy that is more people-centered. And that sounds like crazy. What else would you center it on? But I don't think that is what we've had. We've had a kind of long-term goal, competing powers, pieces on the chessboard approach to diplomacy, not a look at foreign policy in terms of what is the impact on people on the ground. And now we know what they think, they express what they think. And I hope that will lead us towards a more people-centered diplomacy. And I'd like to just say one thing about deep listening, because that is something I've worked in my project at Georgetown. The Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics has worked on in particular, and we have developed, it's really been developed by my colleague, Derek Goldman, who is a theater artist and writer and director. It's called Performing One Another. Very simple technique of deep listening where you pair off two people, you interview each other on a common theme, you record it, and then you select 1 minute or something out of the interview and you present the other person. You literally embody the other person and present the other person to the group. We have initiated, the lab has initiated an initiative between Georgetown students and students at a conservative Christian college in Virginia called Patrick Henry College. Very different student population than Georgetown, which is a kind of international liberal arts college. And it mirrors in a microcosm the divide that you all see and have seen on display in the United States. The very significant cultural divide we have now between, you can say, rural, urban, different classes, but certainly different cultural beliefs, conservative, liberal, whatever you want to call it. It's a very sharp divide. I don't have the answer to solving the whole country's problems, but I think you can start little by little. And with our students who represent two very different types of populations that really represent in ways the two sides of this divide, in spending a semester, some of them a year, doing different exercises in this performing one another mode, they of course discover the common ground, even if they don't agree on politics, but they discovered their common humanity. And I think that, only culture can give us that.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for also these encouraging words. I think that encouragement for culture and arts is something that we also need nowadays. And now one question for Monika from Monatazor. I hope I pronounced it very well. She thinks it's an amazing conference addressing very important aspect of sustainable peace, and also reflecting upon the presentation of Mr. Manuel. And the question is, how can professional centers and persons advocate for an inclusion of cultural negotiation in the mediation and address it clearly at the part of peace documents, just as power and wealth sharing and other aspects of security? This is for you, Monika.
Well, I'm not quite sure if I will find a good answer to that, but I do my best, because by the end, I think these negotiations have obviously a lot to do with well, this political power and the distribution of power. And there is the question who of the negotiating parties or the mediators or whoever have you thinks about including culture. And I guess it is difficult to include yourself as a cultural center or as an artist or whatever, because you lack this kind of power. But maybe to look at it a bit more broader, in a broader sense, Milena mentioned that many artistic initiatives, cultural initiatives just come from individual artists. And also some of the examples here we heard were just by people or parts of civil society doing something in this field. And I think you can make a difference also by just doing something in this field. And coming back to my background, or rather my activist background, there are many artists working in this field, which is kind of logical because artists usually deal with societal problems, with societal conflicts, and maybe even a bit sooner than other people. As Cynthia mentioned, that this can also be seen as a kind of prognosis of upcoming conflicts. So I think the arts are in a way more innovative than many fields, including my own academia, to include problems. And so this can make a difference, I guess, in any kind of conflicts, and certainly in this question of refugees and migrants, because there were have been a lot of artistic productions, especially around the year 2015, but also before and after, and they can make a difference. It is not, I mean, this can lead to all the kinds of problems which we already mentioned, also about like re-enhancing conflicts, reenacting a past which is problematic. And I think we lack the time to go into that, but I think it would be a very important topic for another kind of discussion. So how to deal with memories and with ways of getting to a future together with and in spite of memories. This was also mentioned several times yesterday about having your narrative about the past and then kind of bringing it to the fore and comparing it, but on the other hand, not reenacting the past. I think this is super interesting, but too much now. So I think this, I mean, such cultural activities can also be problematic, but by the end of the day, I think culture and the arts are a great means to present problems in another way, or present maybe not only problems, but the way in which a society works in another way, because you get it a bit outside of everyday problems, and you can either enact and deal with conflicts in another way, or show what is the common ground. Yeah, and in this sense, I think maybe it would be more promising if cultural actors and producers make themselves part of peace procedures than waiting for being invited.
Thank you very much, Monika. We are slowly approaching the end of the panel discussion, but for the last part, I would like to invite Professor Milena to shortly answer one question from the audience and also give us a kind of a wrap-up of our panel. So migrants, immigrants, refugees, what would be the most appropriate term among these, and especially in terms of how to avoid the controversial racist connotations that the right wing in the West often assigns to either of these terms?
Of course, people who leave their country, they are leaving their countries from different reasons. And it would be very difficult to put all of them under the same term and same umbrella. But most, for example, of those people that we are meeting in Serbia, Bosnia, and so on, in Greece, on different islands, are really exilants. I don't know if this word exists in English, but they are going to exile. because they are forced to go to exile. And thus I think that the appropriate word is a refugee. People usually say, no, it doesn't, because Afghan, Bangladesh, Pakistanis, they're leaving their country due to economic reasons. But most of them are coming from rural areas. They're belonging to national minorities there, and they are, in fact, they're escaping different kind of repression. So I think it's very difficult to speak under using only few terms. I think we have to use different in different contexts. Of course, going to US to study, people are migrating. Those are brain drains that are also very dangerous for the local communities, because they are staying without their most active and creative potential, developers, social change makers, those that are capable to build bridges. But in those cases, these people definitely are not refugees, but they are going to, in a certain sense, they are going to exile, because there is no academia in their countries that is going to offer them a decent research, teaching, exploratory, and some other job. So my beginning of my expose about this was just a warning that we have to be careful, and that this word migrant is so nice, because people are migrating. German retired people are migrating to Spain for decades already, because they want to have, or Americans within America, they go to Florida to enjoy sunshine and so on. So migrant is really the word without a lot of meaning today, because it's covered everything. So I first have to thank all the panelists for bringing so many important and different issues, but all issues extremely, linked to our topic of debate, starting, for example, with MONIKA speaking with a culture as a way of life, cultural peace, arts as a condensed forms of national identity, but also arts as the contest, the question of these same norms and canons, and I would say arts that normally would like to transcend all of these canons, norms, and so on. And for this reason, I'm going just to quote now one of the present conflict is Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict. No one ever is using in this mediation the Sergei Parajanov works. Sergei Parajanov is the person that connects not only Azerbaijan and Armenia, he connects it also Georgia, but the museum of Sergei Parajanov we can find only in Armenia, where he lived only 2 years of his life, created nothing. In Georgia, which was the hometown of his family for hundreds of years, his native house, which is in the urban center, as many houses in urban center of Tbilisi, is ruining, and no one is keeping attention of Sergei Parajanov because he was not ethnically Georgian. What he praised in his movies, Azerbaijani culture, Central Asian culture. He was even personally traveling a lot around Central Asia, Muslim regions, collecting textile, integrating colors that are in fact colors of the Muslim cultures of Central Asia and so on. So not to speak about his links with Russia, Ukraine and so on, so he would really be the personality that embeds in his films possibilities for mutual understanding in dialogue, because he personally, as ethnic Armenian, he went to Turkey. He was open for dialogue, but he as such doesn't convene to anyone. especially not to politicians. So he is avoided. But I thank Monika to exactly focus on this, that arts embeds national identity, at the same time transcend. And Sergei Parchanov is like a paradigm for understanding both, because he is, even in his personal life, breaking all the conventions of gender, sex, relations, and so on. So he's really personality to be studied. I would thank Cynthia for entering several very important issues, but specifically showing to us to what extent both popular culture and folk culture can be, how I'd say, the path for change making, for bridging people together. That even this, usually in the West, among intelligentsia, very contested and questioned programs such as talents and so on, in fact, are great programs for the not only gender emancipation, women emancipation, but exactly as you said, meritocracy. It can show that you can, which in many countries, especially within authoritarian patriarchal regime, women doesn't think they can achieve anything without being supported by tribe, by family, by father or husband. But here in this model, it works differently. That culture humanizes, that culture heals and reconciles. And for that, especially music is the crossing border and crossing ethnic borders, I would say, has a huge potential, and also because it immediately goes to emotions and raises people, raises adrenaline and so on. It can be one of the most important instruments of mediation, of conflict resolution. Of course, there is a need for debate, discussions, and so on again, but that can be a preliminary to just show that we can understand emotionally without any, how to say, that's just that music or sport also, that's also very important part. We later saw that on Doug's examples. So both Doug and Cynthia mentioned listening. That is also something that I would like to underline. Coming from the country that was also receiver of international humanitarian developmental help, and also having a chance to go myself to deliver such a kind of help, I know to what extent we are not given time as mediators to listen. That's one thing. Secondly, certain level of Western or global North arrogance is preventing, not all of us, of course, but most of us, to listen. We come with solution. We come with proposals. By the way, this agreement that Kosovo, Serbia, and US have signed in Washington 2 months ago, it was preconceived in Trump's cabinet. So it was not something that he listened to partners and so on. Everything was preconceived and brought on the table. So, or you are going to agree, and with the money coming from the global North, very often people are not able to refuse. I would like also to underline one thing that Doug said, which is also rarely taken in account, that even within one same ethnic group, we have such a cultural differences, as it was in Colombian case between urban and rural language. But if the reconciliation process it should be now ongoing more, because it was just the agreement process. Now should be a reconciliation process, have to bridge that. The country where reconciliation was never done is Cambodia. And that is the country that is stuck in its past, that it's stuck in its trauma and cauchemars, and because exactly no one even tried to make Khmer Rouge, except few leaders. That was illiterate rural population, completely illiterate, literally. It's not like just metaphorical, like they don't have enough knowledge. And the victims has been mostly urban population. So these divisions stay till today and don't enable country to really strongly goes forward. There are also many other reasons, but I would like to underline that these kind of things, the cultural divisions which are now visible in America, that might be in US, they might be underlined by racial divisions and so on, but they are also cultural divisions, not only linked to racial or gender problem like Me Too movement and so on. So what I would like also to say, just for, have I 1 minute more for conclusion? Okay, just to tell about the power of really citizens, individual projects, such as Daniel Barenboim, No Border West Eastern Divan, or Premil Petrovic, No Border Orchestra, that combines musicians from all sides. But interestingly enough, if you look to the donors of those projects, you don't find public foundations, you don't find even big foundations, you find only private persons, families, and so on, or mostly. And that's for me significant. Something has also to be done so that these cultural initiatives that are involved in the real reconciliation processes through arts and so on be recognized on the international scheme by important international but also intergovernmental organizations, and supported by them, because these kind of that's how civil society activism can link in the most positive manner with public diplomacy and all the efforts of international organizations in order to really make our whole world better and conflicts be prevented. And that's also one of my, that very often we wait for the conflict to grow, instead to prevent, when we see fake news, hatred speech started to spread and anger is going up. Thus, my last comment, I would say that's high time for Bulgarian and Northern Macedonian artists to join the negotiation process, not let only politicians and historians to define their future and their culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Milena. And now it's the final time for the final thoughts. So I invite also dear colleagues, other panelists, for a very short message, and then we're finishing. Please.
I wanted to add a couple of comments following up on some of what Milena and the others have said. Two examples, one from Europe, one from the United States, on this issue of the importance of history and understanding a shared history. I remember when I was ambassador in Holland, it was right at the time the EU was expanding so dramatically to take in so many more countries, and there was a big conference in The Hague with the EU minister of whatever his title was, expansion or something. And he was in charge of this. And he was speaking in front of a large audience, and he gave a completely incomprehensible talk about, you know, this department was going to merge with this department. He could have been talking about the merger of two plumbing companies, nothing about the content. And someone from the audience, it was open to the public, someone from the audience raised his hand, and he was a history teacher in a high school. And he said, "What are you going to do about the teaching of history? Is there a plan to review and potentially rewrite history books, textbooks?" And this minister was so disrespectful to this person for this question. He said, "I don't know why you're asking me this ridiculous question," and was totally dismissive of it. And the very interesting thing was that 4 or 5 other members of the audience, all different backgrounds, kept raising their hands and saying, "Please answer his question. What are you doing about history?" And it was just so striking that the public audience immediately grasped this. And, you know, sadly, the bureaucrat in charge, who I hope wasn't in charge very long, had not the faintest clue what they were talking about. And I want to just pivot to the United States to say that I think the lack of a shared understanding of our history is really at the root of a lot of the divisions in the United States right now. And, you know, for me and so many Americans, the image of someone carrying a Confederate flag inside our Capitol building, that is something that didn't happen during the Civil War. That has never happened before. And that flag is such a sign of division and, you know, cruelty. It's a sign of slavery. So there's this tremendous debate, and, you know, how to bridge this enormous gap. The lab at Georgetown is trying to do that through a personal story. And I think in a way that's the only way that we will be able to make headway in the United States, in Central Europe, wherever it is around these divisions, is to focus on individual narratives. And I'll explain what we're doing in just one sec. You know, there's this new trend of narrative economics. We don't have yet narrative foreign policy. And I don't know why, because that is how we live our lives. We live our lives through stories, and that is what moves people and moves them to change their perceptions. You know, this is neurologically known that we change our political opinions through emotions, and we're going to get there through stories. So what we're doing is taking an individual story of one person. Her name is Melisande Colomb, and she relates to Georgetown University's slave history. My university, which is a Jesuit university, and has a history of its own, a shameful history of its own. In 1838, the Jesuits, then running Georgetown, sold from their plantations in Maryland, where they had slaves. Maryland is a divided state, some slaves, some not. The Jesuits, I just want this to sink in. The Jesuits, you know, people, men of God, owned slaves. And Georgetown was bankrupt. It didn't charge tuition then. So to raise the money they needed to keep Georgetown University operating in 1838, they sold 272 slaves, and they were sent to Louisiana. The university, now Georgetown is a very good liberal arts university. The university, nonetheless, had not publicized this story. It was known. It was publicized in a New York Times article about 5 years ago. The university's story was that all of these slaves died when they got to Louisiana. Well, that seems very odd because somehow they had survived the Atlantic Passage, yet they couldn't survive going to Louisiana. How could that be? And why would that be? Well, it's pretty convenient for the university if they're all dead. It's a little more awkward if they're living descendants. And one alumnus of the university decided to investigate, see if there were any descendants, and hired a geneticist. Well, there are, of course, thousands of descendants of these slaves. And Melly Colombe is one of those descendants. And she learned of her background a few years ago through the geneticist. She decided at age 63 to enroll as a student at Georgetown and to get to know this institution that existed because of the sale of her ancestors. And we are now creating with her, she is writing and she will be performing a one-person performance called Here I Am, that tells her story of discovering her background, attending Georgetown, what it means to her, interwoven with excerpts from the archives at Georgetown, which includes words from the slaves and from the Jesuits, interwoven with original music created by jazz artist Somi. And we hope that this will be, first of all, a sensational artistic experience, but also a way in, a platform for discussion of this incredibly fraught issue of the legacy of slavery in the United States. You know, lots of people say, well, there aren't any slaves anymore. What is there to talk about? And we hope that through the story of one person, you know, you can't say, no, that's not true. I mean, that is her story. Through the story of one person in the present and looking to the past, we can create a kind of neutral platform so that people can come around it and share their questions, share their doubts, share their animosities, if that's what it is. But help us along the way, because honestly, if in the United States, if we can't come to some shared understanding about our history, we are never going to heal these divisions.
Cynthia, thank you very much for sharing this story. It's, I think, very, very important and also interesting. If there is some more comments, or shall we close? I think we're running a bit out of time. Thank you all very much. This was a very, very fruitful discussion. And thank you for the also questions from the audience. I would just put a kind of a message to take away, and that is that culture can make a difference exactly through fostering a reflexive dialogue, what we mentioned, acknowledging cultural diversity, and also by encouraging artistic practices and creativity. Because in the end, human beings are creative beings, and that is what really matters. Thank you all very much.
Thank you to all the panelists and the moderator. We will now be taking a short 5-minute break before we proceed with the closing session. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We will now be beginning with the closing session. Before we begin, I would like to mention that tomorrow we begin the first day of the virtual course on how to manage the cultural dimension in conflict resolution. For any attendees that may be interested to find out more about this course, please visit us at cultureandmediation.org. We will now begin the closing session with the co-chairs of the conference, who will summarize the points from the discussions in the last 2 days. We will begin with Professor Sun. So Professor Sun, if you can please take the stage.
Hi, thank you. This is a very important and inspiring and fruitful conference. Throughout all the panelists' brilliant talks and discussion in the 3 sessions, we have explored the different aspects regarding culture in conflict mediation and resolution. I think this is a great learning and thinking process for all of us, for all the panelists and for all the participants and for all the audience. I would like to summarize, through the following 4 points. First, what is culture? So we have talked quite a lot about the definition of culture. It seems we all agree that culture refers to a complex whole, which has been developed on the basis of history, national experiences, personal experiences, memory, emotion, so on and so forth. So it influences people's way of thinking, way of behavior, social norms, values, so on and so forth. Just as Professor MILENA mentioned, it's a whole way of life. But of course, actually in real practice, culture may mean different things in different contexts. We also mentioned that through our discussion, such as maybe sometimes we take it as a kind of universal culture, or sometimes as national culture, or maybe specific culture in a certain field. The second, what attitudes should we have towards culture? I think through our discussion, we all agree that culture actually is very important or extremely important for conflict mediation and resolution. And we discussed we need to be active listener. We need to try to understand, try to be open, try to be inclusive and tolerant to cultural differences. And during this process, of course, we all need to have a kind of critical thinking throughout those cultural differences. Meanwhile, sensitivity, cultural sensitivity is also very important. So that should say, by looking at culture, by thinking about cultural factors, we should not only think about the superficial reasons of the conflicts or of the problems, but we also need to approach the root causes through culture, because sometimes culture cannot be seen. It needs to be understood or felt or interpreted from the bottom of heart. So this is the what we have all agreed, throughout the discussion. And the third one is, how can we use culture for mediation and resolution of conflicts? Just now, Professor Schneider mentioned, culture sometimes is problem, but sometimes it's an answer. So that should say culture really matters for conflict resolution and mediation. And it's very interesting. We discussed small things through, in the last session, such as art, music, sports, so on and so forth. So that's to say, culture can be used as a kind of instrument to solve problems, to bridge differences, between different groups, or to create comfortable or friendly atmosphere. Always say to create a kind of friendly context to solve problems, which is also very important because it can really shape the direction or influences the following efforts of both sides. So in the long run, it helps to shape a kind of mutual understanding for problem solution. But I also think besides being used as an instrument, culture actually can also be a kind of final destination. So that's to say, for international relations, we need to construct a kind of shared interest, shared culture for us to better understand each other. So in this sense, culture is not only a kind of means, but also a kind of final purpose. So it's a kind of ends. And then the fourth point is how could we think or approach or think about culture in a broad sense in international relations? I mean, besides conflict resolution and mediation. Through our discussion, actually, our discussion not only, deals with conflict resolution and mediation. We talk quite a lot about international relations. For instance, Ambassador Schneider mentioned cultural relations or cultural diplomacy. So I really agree because, if we use cultural diplomacy, it seems we want to achieve a kind of, specific purpose. But actually for cultural relations, that's to say we use culture to build, as Ambassador Schneider mentioned just now, we use culture to build a kind of, mutual trust, to strengthen relations or to strengthen deep understanding. So in this sense, actually, culture can be used also to shape our understanding for the future and also to shape the direction for the future. It's very important for the world today because I think one of the panels mentioned the world today, for the world in the 21st century is totally different from the one in the 21st century. Okay, not that many wars or not that many, we say very, very serious conflicts. However, we do need to cope with a lot of global issues. Okay, although they are not that as serious as the war, but they are also very urgent for the whole humanity to solve. We all know that the world is undergoing profound changes, and we are facing a lot of uncertainty, turbulences, especially in the past year. So everyone is wondering, which direction the world is going. So in this case, I think culture is very important for us to learn to share, or to educate people, or to unite the whole, to unite the whole world, to nurture a kind of awareness. To deal with the current global challenges and issues, not only conflicts. So we can use culture in a kind of broad sense to think about the world today. So this is why I think this meeting is this topic. The topic focusing on culture is extremely important for the world today. So this is what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sun. Professor Milena DRAGIĆEVIĆ-ŠEŠIĆ, the floor is yours. You seem to be.
It took me some time to find my mouse and to unmute myself because as I was today, I thought I'm not going to come up so early. In fact, I think what I would like to say is that in these 2 days, we discussed so many different things, but I'm going to focus on really what is close to me, and that's power of art within culture. What brings us closer is arts. Some aspects of cultures might dividing, but it's through great work of arts that we are coming closer and closer together. So, for example, very recently, because it was recently translated in our language, I have read a book, Bakita, of a French woman author, which is about, and we had today question from Darfur, which is about the South Sudan woman saint. And I think that is bringing more, also very important aspects for our discussions, this kind of artwork, the same as, like Ambassador Cynthia Schneider said, performance that one real descendant of the slaves is doing within university that was built, helped by those slaves. In fact, we now leave somehow the issue of slavery on United States, United Kingdom built colonial power. But it's a much more wider issue and important. And today it's only artwork that speaks about it. We basically in Europe found out about Roma slavery in Romania only through a film, through Romanian film, that when I heard that 10 years before, I thought that the Roma guy who was telling me this story found just peculiar excuse for being the only one not speaking Roma language on the course for Roma cultural animators and so on, because he said, I'm Romanian, a Roma, gypsy, and we were forbidden to speak our language. Now I went in a detail, but I just wanted to say, yes, culture is a problem when you are forbidden to speak your language, when your whole ethnic group forget about it. So as culture can be a problem, it can also be a solution if wanted to enter in communication, if wanted to share, enter in a shared space. Because yes, within this each national culture, art might be, as MONIKA MOKRE said, a condensed form of national identity. Look at the poetry, to what extent Prešern in Slovenia, DRAGIČEVIĆ in Serbia, or Mahmud Darwish in Palestine. For example, just to take poets, or Wisława Szymborska, Seamus Heaney, are taken as symbols of national identity, because also poetry is the most condensed form of art. But art can also be the most important contesters of all the, not only of the artistic issues such as avant-garde or Malevich. You can really hardly define him in ethnic cultural backgrounds and so on, or Marina Abramović for Serbia, for Montenegro, and so on. But most of the artistic work, as I have shown on the example of Parajanov, is transcending the issue, or in fact, showing us how our experiences, like in the case of Bakita, the girl slave for South Sudan, becoming Catholic priest, the only Catholic woman priest from Africa, from not being the real martyr, and so on, how in fact show us that slavery was not only characteristic for, let's say, mutual relations among Africans and so on, that Italians that took her, they wanted to consider her as a slave. But all these experiences of making individual trajectory and going through different cultures that all in a certain way repressed her, reshaped her, and so on, you might keep it, although even not knowing your own name, you might keep your individual integrity and individuality. And that's again a culture that is helping you. Shared understanding. And that's the key issue, I would say, that we as academics, intellectuals, public officers, civil society activists, so all sorts of us have to work on to bring shared understanding, not only of different cultures, but of our own and its history, shared cultural memory. And for that, we might use everything. As again, to quote Ambassador Schneider, we might use individual narratives. And I would like to use this opportunity to take attention on one seminal book of Maria Todorova, which is Imagining Balkans, that used narratives to analyze the impact of 19th century narratives of travelers, different people who came to the Balkans, politicians, ambassadors, but also others, even literate people and artists, to create, to influence creation of later foreign policy narratives and diplomatic narratives that were oriented toward Balkans. Interestingly enough, Maria Todorova now was analyzing that was like foreign created narratives about us. And more recently, she made also analysis of the present self-created narratives that are used to make more differentiations, even among one same ethnic group, such as Bulgarians and so on, to make more distinctions than bridging people understanding together. So to come back again to the issue that I think was very important, we spoke a lot about the way how culture humanizes individuals, but also groups, how a music concert can bring people together, how reading one of the same book make each person humanizing individuals, but then they are parts of different groups, but also how culture heals, reconciles, and there are very different testimonies. And I think that would be also very important, really, to create a base of narratives, of testimonies, how cultural event, especially that one done within the process of reconciliation, changed our lives, the lives of community, but to then make the use of these narratives in the phases of conflict prevention, when we see, and that's, I think, would be the crucial. If we wouldn't wait for the conflict to burst, to foresee when and how it is coming, and really try to use arts and culture tools as a forms of conflict preventions. For that, donors are difficult to be found. They are more easy to be found when it is phase of the reconciliation, post-huge conflict, and empathy of everyone is huge. But that's, again, one of the plea. Please do not react only on the basis of empathy. Of course, we have to react on that also, but let's try to see who are the subaltern, who are the oppressed group, and try to approach them when to give them self-confidence, to give them self-esteem, trust in international organization, trust in possible public policy measures so that they can renegotiate their position, their status in one same community, and that they can finally become more or less equal members of those communities. So that with this plaidoyer for arts and culture in conflict prevention, I would end my expose today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor DRAGIĆEVIĆ-ŠEŠIĆ. Finally, we have Ambassador Milos Strugar with the final remarks.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Sun and Professor DRAGIČEVIĆ-ŠEŠIĆ, for the summary. I don't feel a need to dwell more on this because I agree with all your points. I will try to summarize some of common conclusions or points from the discussions, in my view, but also to list some important questions which I believe remained open after these 2 days and need to be discussed more in the follow-up activities. So as commonalities, as Professor Sun said, culture plays a crucial role in every conflict by shaping and influencing our understanding, basic understanding of the conflict. The second point is that cross-culture conflict often leads or is burdened by failure to communicate and by mutually different interpretations of events or statements, messages. That third point would be that the barriers for cross-culture communications and understanding are especially powerful national and ethnic identities, but also stereotypes, prejudices, and tribalism in general. Next point, I think it is important to emphasize that the term identity, ethnicity, nation, they're closely related to culture, but they're not the same. The main difference is that these three, identity, ethnicity, and nation, operate at the conscious level, while culture, the most important part of the culture, is at the subconscious level. I would say that we also agree that the general objective of conflict prevention and conflict resolution is that all parties in the dispute interpret messages or understand the messages in the same way. It's not an easy task to achieve, but that is the general objective. A third-party intervention, whether mediator or facilitator, is also limited by their own cultural lens, and that we should not forget. Next point is the importance which was emphasized throughout 3 panels of listening, or new term introduced by Alistair Crook, deep listening. And also the vision of history and interpretation of history and the vision of future. These are I think, I dare to say that these are kind of a common threads or commonalities in all the discussions. But there are some very important questions which I think remained open for further discussion and contemplation. First is culture at the root of conflict? We heard different views on this. Do cultural differences impede conflict prevention and the resolution? Is it possible to go into other culture? Is it possible at all? Should cross-cultural resolution focus on processes and the relations building instead of focusing on the outcome. This, I think, we also heard different views on this. Shall we rely more on traditional mechanisms for conflict resolution, which are shaped by specific cultures? And I'm not talking about going to the past. I'm talking about looking into the future, but using something which proved to be useful. Traditional mechanisms based on a local or specific culture. One question is, how does terminology or linguistics, and I'm sorry that Professor Sun didn't have time to address this issue, how terminology influences the narrative or framing of conflict? This is also open question. And I would say last open question, are the information communication technologies, social media, mainstream media, helping to overcome barriers or actually reinforcing barriers and the bubbles to understand other cultures and different worldviews? I think there are many important questions which we addressed during these 2 days, but didn't come up, I think, with the full answers, and I think we don't have full answers. And that is why I believe there is a need to continue this discussion through creating a network of all the speakers and the attendees at this conference, and which we will try to do in next few days, and but also by organizing follow-up events, whether conferences or smaller seminars and training courses. Training courses which are more kind of a discussion and the experience sharing than actually lecturing. And we have one, as mentioned, which starts tomorrow, jointly organized by the China Foreign Affairs University, University of Arts Belgrade, and Conflict Center. And we already plan and fixed the next one in the fall of this year. So thank you very much. And maybe, Tanya, if you allow me, I would like to thank all the speakers for sharing their knowledge and experience. And but I would also like to thank all the audience for being interactive and enthusiastic and involved and interested. And also I would like to thank those who you don't see during this conference. This is a group of young people from our 3 institutions who prepared this conference and work very hard for the last 2.5 months to make this happen with really commitment and determination, which I personally witness and admire. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And with that, we close the conference and would like to thank everyone once again for participating, and thank you to our excellent speakers for the last 2 days. We wish you all the best, and for more information on the course, visit us at cultureinmediation.org. Wishing you all a pleasant rest of the day.